Trade and Commerce, in which he displays such a clear and comprehensive knowledge of the subject as might lead the reader to think that its author had devoted all his life to it. I asked him whether he knew much of Rolt and of his work. "Sir," said he, "I never saw the man, and never read the book. The booksellers wanted a preface to a Dictionary of Trade and Commerce. I knew very well what such a dictionary should be, and I wrote a preface accordingly." Rolt, who wrote a great deal for the booksellers, was, as Johnson told me, a singular character. Though not in the least acquainted with him, he used to say, "I am just come from Sam Johnson." This was a sufficient specimen of his vanity and impudence, but he gave a more eminent proof of it in our sister kingdom, as Dr. Johnson informed me. When Akenside's Pleasures of the Imagination first came out, he did not put his name to the poem. Rolt went over to Dublin, published an edition of it, and put his own name to it. Upon the fame of this he lived for several months, being entertained at the best tables as "the ingenious Mr. Rolt." His conversation indeed did not discover much of the fire of a poet, but it was recollected that both Addison and Thomson were equally dull till excited by wine. Akenside, having been informed of this imposition, vindicated his right by publishing the poem with its real author's name. Several instances of such literary fraud have been detected. The Reverend Dr. Campbell, of St. Andrew's, wrote an Inquiry into the Original of Moral Virtue, the manuscript of which he sent to Mr. Innes, a clergyman in England, who was his countryman and acquaintance. Innes published it with his own name to it, and before the imposition was discovered, obtained a considerable promotion as reward of his merit. Note: I have had inquiry made in Ireland as to this story, but do not find it recollected there. I give it on the authority of Dr. Johnson, to which may be added that of the Biographical Dictionary and Biographia Dramatica, in both of which it has stood for many years. Mr. Malone observes, that the truth probably is, not that an edition was published with Rolt's name in the title page, but that the poem, being then anonymous, Rolt acquiesced in its being attributed to him in conversation. End of note. The celebrated Dr. Hugh Blair and his cousin Mr. George Bannatyne, when students in divinity, wrote a poem entitled The Resurrection, copies of which were handed about in manuscript. They were, at length, very much surprised to see a pompous edition of it in folio, dedicated to the Princess Dowager of Wales, by a Dr. Douglas, as his own. Some years ago, a little novel, entitled The Man of Feeling, was assumed by Mr. Eccles, a young Irish clergyman, who was afterwards drowned near Bath. He had been at the pains to transcribe the whole book, with blottings, interlineations, and corrections, that it might be shown to several people as an original. It was, in truth, the production of Mr. Henry Mackenzie, an attorney in the Exchequer at Edinburgh, who is the author of several other ingenious pieces. But the belief with regard to Mr. Eccles became so general, that it was thought necessary for Messrs. Strahan and Cadell to publish an advertisement in the newspapers, contradicting the report, and mentioning that they purchased the copyright of Mr. Mackenzie. I can conceive this kind of fraud to be very easily practised with successful effrontery. The filiation of a literary performance is difficult of proof. Seldom is there any witness present at its birth. A man, either in confidence or by improper means, obtains possession of a copy of it in manuscript, and boldly publishes it as his own. The true author, in many cases, may not be able to make his title clear. Johnson, indeed, from the peculiar features of his literary offspring, might bid defiance to any attempt to appropriate them to others. Quote, "But Shakespeare's magic could not copied be, within that circle none durst walk but he." End quote. He this year lent his friendly assistance to correct and improve a pamphlet written by Mr. Gwynne, the architect, entitled Thoughts on the Coronation of George III. Johnson had now for some years admitted Mr. Baretti to his intimacy, nor did their friendship cease upon their being separated by Mr. Baretti's revisiting his native country, as appears from Johnson's letters to him. Quote, "To Mr. Joseph Baretti, at Milan. You reproach me very often with parsimony of writing, but you may discover by the extent of my paper that I design to recompense rarity by length. A short letter to a distant friend is, in my opinion, an insult like that of a slight bow or cursory salutation, a proof of unwillingness to do much, even where there is a necessity of doing something. Yet it must be remembered that he who continues the same course of life in the same place will have little to tell. 1 week and 1 year are very much like one another. The silent changes made by time are not always perceived, and if they are not perceived, cannot be recounted. I have risen and lain down, talked and mused, while you have roved over a considerable part of Europe. Yet I have not envied my Baretti any of his pleasures, though perhaps I have envied others his company, and I am glad to have other nations made acquainted with the character of the English by a traveller who has so nicely inspected our manners, and so successfully studied our literature. I received your kind letter from Falmouth, in which you gave me notice of your departure for Lisbon, and another from Lisbon, in which you told me that you were to leave Portugal in a few days. To either of these, how could any answer be returned? I have had a third from Turin, complaining that I have not answered the former. Your English style still continues in its purity and vigour. With vigour your genius will supply it, but its purity must be continued by close attention. To use 2 languages familiarly, and without contaminating one by the other, is very difficult, and to use more than 2 is hardly to be hoped. The praises which some have received for their multiplicity of languages may be sufficient to excite industry, but can hardly generate confidence. I know not whether I can heartily rejoice at the kind reception which you have found, or at the popularity to which you are exalted. I am willing that your merit should be distinguished, but cannot wish that your affections may be gained. I would have you happy wherever you are, yet I would have you wish to return to England. If ever you visit us again, you will find the kindness of your friends undiminished. To tell you how many enquiries are made after you would be tedious, or if not tedious would be vain, because you may be told in a very few words that all who knew you wish you well, and that all you embraced at your departure will caress you at your return. Therefore do not let Italian academicians nor Italian ladies drive us from your thoughts. You may find among us what you will leave behind, soft smiles and easy sonnets. Yet I shall not wonder if all our invitations should be rejected, for there is a pleasure in being considerable at home, which is not easily resisted. By conducting Mr. Southwell to Venice, you fulfilled, I know, the original contract. Yet I would wish you not wholly to lose him from your notice, but to recommend him to such acquaintance as may best secure him from suffering by his own follies, and to take such general care of both his safety and his interest as may come within your power. His relations will thank you for any such gratuitous attention. At least they will not blame you for any evil that may happen, whether they thank you or not for any good. You know that we have a new king, and a new Parliament.